Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Will the story on behalf of the wife be different, or will some of the details change? Today's story has a similar plot. Enjoy the show! Ellen's story. No, I don't want to spend any more nights in this bed. Probably never again. Thus ended our terrible discussion that began with my confession that I had slept with Chris. Dan entered the house, packed his suitcase, and left. I did what you'd probably expect. I cried for half the night and then tried to pull myself together to get through the next day. Luckily, the day was completely routine because I couldn't concentrate on anything. Just like last day, was it just yesterday? I had to restrain myself from calling Chris, but today I fought the urge to call Dan. I knew that despite his rage and pain, he would not do anything reckless. I was sure that he would get in touch, at least to let me know where he was and that he was okay. It seemed to me that I needed to wait until he took this step himself and not insist on my own and call first. I had to keep waiting. Returning home to an empty house and making myself a small dinner, I again realized the consequences of my stupidity. Is this what my life will look like now? Divorced, living alone, spending many evenings eating dinner alone in the kitchen or in front of the TV? Was the man I loved more than anyone in the world, except my children, really gone from my life forever? I couldn't believe it, but I knew that husbands and wives get divorced because of cheating all the time. No one hearing this story would judge Dan. Are you saying that his wife brought home a young guy and spent the whole day with him in their bed? Damn it, poor Dan. But she seemed so sweet when we met. After dinner, I called my sister Diane, 5 years older than me. She has been my best friend since childhood. She gave me advice, protected me from our middle brother Jason when he went on a rampage, taught me about boys, clothes, and makeup, and inspired my endless adoration. Now that we were both adults with jobs, families, and responsibilities, we were a little closer to equals. But I still turn to her for advice and support when problems arise, and this case definitely fit that description. Diane and her husband lived near Pittsburgh, and we didn't see each other as often as we would have liked, but we talked on the phone all the time, so she wasn't surprised to hear from me. Before I could call her, I started telling her the whole story, my initial attraction to Chris, our day in bed, my guilt, that hot night with Dan, my confession, and his angry departure. And before I could start telling the story, I was already crying, sometimes so hard that I could barely speak. It took poor Diane a long time to fully learn the whole story, but she listened patiently, offering sympathetic words and sighs where appropriate. My dear Ellen, she said finally, it's really a mess, isn't it? Yes, I answered, still sobbing, and I arranged all this myself. As we talked, my patient sister helped me realize that I actually had two problems. One is Dan, his pain, and the serious threat to our marriage. Up to a certain point, Al, there's not much you can do about it. You can only let him know how much you love him, how sorry you are, and that you are ready to do almost anything to save the marriage. But the decision about what to do next will ultimately be his. But your second problem is Chris. You still seem to lust for him. She giggled. Sorry, I know you shouldn't laugh, but it looks like you had a really great time with him. It's true, Diane, I said. Thank you for being honest with me. I've never had intimate like his in my life, and all I can do is talk about it endlessly. It was amazing, phenomenal, divine, I don't even know what to say. I was already on edge before we even got to the bedroom, and then he knew exactly what buttons to press. It was a world record for passionate sessions. Okay, Ellen, she said, and I envy you, to be honest. But what now? I don't know, Diane. Obviously, Dan will never take me back if I do this again. I already told Dan that there won't be a second time with Chris. Believe me, I know that my husband and my marriage are much more important than a fleeting affair, even such a cosmic one. But this does not mean that the desire has passed. I'm scared, but I still really want Chris. There was a long pause, then Diane said, Well, Ellen, I think we're getting to the root of the problem. Like I said, there's not much you can do about whether Dan will come back to you, but you definitely need to resolve your feelings for Chris one way or another. As long as he remains in the picture, even just in your head, you will never get your marriage back. I know, I sighed. I'd love for him to go somewhere, like Tanzania, but but unfortunately, he's in his first year of graduate school at U, so he'll probably be around for a couple more years." There was a noise behind me, and Diane said, "Sorry, honey, I have to run. My teenagers are fighting again. Probably again over something important, like the TV remote control. I love you, don't do anything stupid, and call me again soon, okay?" Although Diane did not help me solve my problems, after talking with her, I felt better. It's always been like this. That's what big sisters are for, at least mine. How was the rest of the week? I went to work, came home, and had dinner alone. I lay in bed at night, sometimes crying, always feeling sorry for myself. I was angry with myself. I understood that it was completely my fault, and I tried to remember that what Dan, my completely innocent husband, felt was 100 times worse. How could he ever forgive me for what I did to him? Would I be able to let him back into my heart if he betrayed me the way I betrayed him? So, what the hell am I supposed to do with Chris? Dan called me at home after dinner on Wednesday. The conversation was short and rather gloomy. He wanted to give me his number at the Marriott and let me know he was okay. "I started seeing a therapist," he said. "I was referred by Ed from the counseling center. I've only been to the appointment once, but I think it will be useful. He deals mostly with family issues, so if he offers, maybe I'll call you to invite you to come with me." "Dan, I'll be happy to do it. In fact, I'll happily do whatever you want. I am the one who caused all this, and I am so sorry. I just want you to know how desperately I want you back, but I understand that the decision is yours." There was a long pause, and finally, he said, "Thank you, Ellen. It seems to me that it will take some time before I understand what I want. Tomorrow, I'll probably stop by the house during the day to pick up some things." I felt tears begin to well up in my eyes. "Do you want to come over after work? I could cook you dinner and wash your dirty clothes." Another pause, then he said, "No, thank you. I know you're home, but I'm not ready to see you right now." We said goodbye after a minute or two, and I spent the rest of the evening in tears. The rest of the week was pretty much the same, except for one really scary moment. On Friday, I was sitting at my desk merging files when Emily stopped by to say hello. "Chris said hi to you," she said. "He said it was a pleasure for you to have lunch together at Ellen's last week." I stared at her, not knowing what to say, feeling my face flush. "Chris told her?" For a moment, I was overcome with horror, then I pulled myself together a little. Emily's face showed no malice, only friendly innocence. God bless. It looks like Chris only told his aunt about our dinner. "Oh, sorry, Emily," I said flippantly, my thoughts were somewhere far away. "Yes, Chris and I bumped into each other by chance, and we had fun. He told me a lot about the anthropology department and its political intrigues. I have to say, Chris is pretty insightful for a freshman. He has a good understanding of all these internal feuds." We chatted for a bit, and I was gradually gaining my composure. As Emily was about to leave, she said, "Well, Chris asked me to tell you that he hopes to see you again soon." I blushed again and said something neutral like, "Of course, that would be great." As Emily disappeared around the corner, I dropped my head onto the table. It was a terrible shock. I also realized that once my fear of what Emily might know had subsided, even an innocent conversation about Chris turned me on a little. My mind knew 100% that it was over between Chris and me, that our amazing day was a single mistake that would never happen again. The only problem was that my body didn't seem to get the message yet. Dan's story. On Thursday at 5 p.m., I was again in Arthur's office. We both remembered that the first item on our agenda was Bridget, and I told him in detail how I had been obsessed with Bridget Zuzik for months. Bridget came to Columbus about 6 years ago, the wife of a new star, young assistant professor of economics from Slovakia. Despite her last name, she was Irish and looked the part, tall and slender, with pale skin and bright green eyes. She was a typical Irish redhead, except her hair was jet black. It was shiny and reached just below her shoulders. I was introduced to Bridget at a fall party hosted by the economics department, where about 100 people were mingling and eating snacks in the luxurious modern home of one of the senior faculty members. I politely greeted her husband, Istin, and then almost tripped over my own tongue when I shook Bridget's hand. She was amazing, there's no other word. Her pale skin, Dazzling hair, hypnotic eyes, and perfect figure in a black dress that was quite decent but somehow seductive. And on top of all this, she was a flirt, a tease. I knew it within the first few seconds by the way she held my hand a split second longer and said, "It's very nice to meet you," in that deep, melodic voice that seemed to drag on a little at the start of the sentence. I was almost 40 then, and she could hardly have been more than 28. I was definitely neither handsome nor an idol. Besides, she was the wife of a new professor, and I was simply part of the department's technical support. And despite all this, her greeting affected me as if she was saying, "I want you to meet me in the garden in 10 minutes, and I will wear you to death." I spent the rest of the party in a fog. I managed to chat with other guests whom I had known for a long time, but whenever I could, I watched Bridget. I was absolutely fascinated by her, and it scared the living daylights out of me. Our 10-second acquaintance caused me to become very excited, and although it died down after a few minutes, every time I saw her or even thought about her, it threatened to flare up again. After a couple of hours of wondering what was wrong with me, I decided it was time for Ellen and me to leave. I barely spoke to her during the party, but I saw her happily chatting with our friends. I headed to the bedroom where the coats were folded to get ours before finding Ellen. When I opened the bedroom door, I froze, as did the two people in the room. One of them was Mal Lister, head of the economics department, a tall and handsome man of about 55. The second was Bridget Zuzik. They stood in each other's arms and kissed. When they turned to me, I saw that his hand was squeezing her left breast through her dress, and her hand was halfway in his fly. I froze for a moment, then muttered sorry and quickly walked out, closing the door behind me. The image of what I had just seen and what it meant was racing through my head: the head of the department and the wife of one of his young colleagues, and she had only recently moved to the city. Some of them were clearly very fast. I walked out the French doors into the living room, onto the back deck, to cool down and compose myself. In addition to being shocked, I realized that it turned me on. Just meeting Bridget was enough to fill me with a desire I hadn't felt in years, but seeing the way she held Mal Lister made me feel my own arousal in my pants. I probably stood there alone for about 10 minutes, finally deciding that they had probably already left the room. I was going to go back for my coat, but when I straightened up, I was surprised to see Bridget next to me, with a smile reminiscent of the Mona Lisa. We both spoke at the same time. I said, "Sorry for barging in like that," and she said, "Sorry for embarrassing you." We both smiled in synchronicity, and then she spoke again. "Sorry, Dan, there was no embarrassment," she said, her face showing no signs of guilt, only amusement. "It probably wasn't the best place for what we were doing. I guess I should have knocked," I said, feeling myself blush, but I never thought that anyone could be there. She took my arm and squeezed it, turning us both so that our backs were to the house and our faces to the garden. No, it's our fault," she laughed softly, a surprisingly pleasant sound. Again, I felt desire overcome me. Then, she looked at me more seriously. "Dan, tell me, have you ever imagined for a minute what it would be like if you were in my place? Have you thought about it, even a little?" She turned her body towards me and kissed my ear. "Yeah, I think you've really thought about it, haven't you, Dan?" She laughed her wonderful, melodious laugh again, then left me and returned to the party in the living room. I stood there for another 5 minutes, stunned but incredibly excited. What was that? Was this a proposal, or just a continuation of her teasing? Or perhaps a way to reinforce her gratitude for my promise to remain silent? Whatever it was, I was shocked. At that point, I would have given my entire life savings, and probably my kids' college funds, for the chance to sleep with Bridget Zuzik. There was nothing in my head but desire for her, a desire so strong that it overshadowed all thoughts of decency, loyalty to Ellen, or even common sense. After another 5 minutes, when my excitement had subsided enough to be hidden, I returned to the bedroom for my coat, found Ellen, thanked the owners, and quickly drove us home. Ellen and I were chatting about the party, but I could barely hear what we were saying. I paid the nanny, and then, without any ceremony, I pulled Ellen into the bedroom. She looked at me in surprise, but I couldn't explain my behavior. I just said, "I can't explain it, honey, but you're so beautiful, and I want you so badly right now." This was enough, and soon I had her clothes off. She only allowed me to take off her dress, asking, "Don't tear my beautiful green dress." That night, I had intimacy with her like a man possessed. I couldn't slow down for tender caresses. As soon as she let me, I was between her legs, greedily pleasuring her, but not gently. At first, she tried to stop me and asked me to slow down. We didn't often have a night this rough, but she had drunk some champagne and was more than ready to play her part. I kiss her, I whisper her name again and again, but Bridget was in my head the entire time. After a couple of minutes, I was already on the verge. It wasn't just intim, it was a mad passion more intense than anything we'd done in the last 10 years. When we caught our breath, Ellen said, "Wow, who is this, and what have you done with my husband?" "Oh, that guy," I said. "He said I could keep you busy for a couple of rounds tonight." "I think he's still at the party." "A couple of rounds?" "Maybe he forgot to tell you that I'm an old, tired married lady with 2 children who sleep in the next room." "Yes, he mentioned something about it, but he also said that once you warm up, you'll have a ton of energy." I chuckled, by now gently stroking her breasts, and she started responding to it. We were both excited, and only one of us knew that at that moment, I was mentally caressing not Ellen, but Bridget's small, firm breasts. Suddenly, I wanted the room to be dark. I reached for the lamp and turned it off. The second time, I lasted longer. In my head, I was making love to Bridget again, but this time softly, and the darkness helped me imagine this fantasy. Only at the very end did my tenderness leave me. I got so excited that I began to violently pull Ellen toward me by her hips. Luckily, Ellen was just as passionate about it as I was. We hugged, and she whispered, "Thank you, prisoner. When you see my husband, Dan, tell him he can come over anytime." I didn't know whether to be happy or guilty. I pleased Ellen and myself, and she, of course, had no idea that my sudden rush of desire was caused by another woman. But I knew. In the months that followed, we had a night more often and more passionately than we had since we had children. I probably mentally slept with Bridget 50 times. Of course, it was only Bridget in my head. In bed with me was Ellen, who unbeknownst to me was playing the role of a dark-haired Irish woman married to someone else. Ellen asked several times what was happening to me, but I could never give her a good explanation. The best I could say was, "I don't know, honey." At some point, I realized that I was soon 40. I don't want to go through one of those midlife crises when you buy a red Porsche, but I want to enjoy life as much as possible, and you look so gorgeous that I just want you every chance I get. I don't want to wake up one day as an 80-year-old and wish we had an intimate more when I still could. She seemed quite happy with this answer, and while I missed the point, my insane lust for Bridget, the rest of my explanation was plausible enough that I could live with it. I saw Bridget a few more times, but we no longer had any flirtations like we had at the party. We met at economics department meetings, but only to wave and smile at each other across the room. I haven't heard any rumors, so either she's cooled off on Mal Lister or they've become more cautious. At the end of that year, her star husband got a job at MUU, and they moved to New York. My obsession with her gradually waned. I still fantasize about her, but not as often or with the same intensity. Unfortunately, this meant that Ellen's nightlife returned to its previous level. About a year after Bridget first drove me crazy, everything was back to how it was before she came to Columbus. Ellen never knew about my hidden, insane lust. I related the whole story to Arthur, who listened attentively and sympathetically. When I finished, he nodded at me. "So I'm guessing, Dan, that you see a parallel between your desire for Bridget and Ellen's recent desire for Chris?" "Yes, of course," I replied. "There is an obvious difference, and it is very important. I never acted on my obsession. I never had an intimate with Bridget. I never betrayed Ellen with her or anyone else. But the thing is, Arthur, I thought about it a lot, both then and now. Maybe I didn't cheat on Ellen with Bridget simply because I didn't have the chance. What if I met her in a restaurant? Maybe I would have started flirting with her, and if she reciprocated, it's hard to imagine that I would have refused." He looked at me. "Have you ever stalked her? Did you call her or offer to meet her?" "No, but not because I didn't want to. I just never thought that she might be interested in me. She was clearly a flirt, but between her husband and the head of the department, I thought she already had the full package. So, in the end, I was guilty of nothing but the vivid fantasies that led to the great night that Ellen and I both enjoyed. But, Arthur, can I really say I'm better than Ellen? We both had some kind of crazy flash of passionate desire for someone else. She accidentally met her man and acted on her desire, and I just didn't get that chance. Does this mean I'm innocent and she is guilty, or does it just mean that her temptation was irresistible and I didn't have it? Arthur thought for a minute and then said, "Your last phrase, Dan, irresistible temptation, seems to be the key to your perception of this whole situation. Was your desire for Bridget truly overpowering? Would you have been able to resist if, say, you met her in a restaurant and she proposed to you?" I shook my head slowly. "I don't know, Arthur. I thought about it a lot then. God knows how much I thought about it this week, and I don't know. I wish I could say, of course, I'm stronger than that. I'm committed to Ellen. I'd say no, thank you. But at the time, my desire for Bridget was driving me crazy. I thought about her all the time. Every time I walked into the department, I hoped to meet her by chance, fantasizing about her, in bed with me, with Mal Lister, with her husband. I was almost crazy for a while. We need to stop here, Dan, Arthur said after a minute. But I think we need to continue this conversation when we meet again. How about Tuesday? I believe that your feelings about your obsession and about Ellen's obsession will be key to how you decide the future of your marriage. Thank you, Arthur. I'm pretty sure you're right. The days dragged on. Workdays weren't so bad because I had things to do that kept me busy, but the weekends were terrible, empty, and lonely. I wasn't ready to confide in my friends, so I spent time alone. I took long walks, hoping it would help me stay in shape. They certainly gave me a lot of time to think. I spent a long time on the phone with each of my children, but I didn't tell them anything about what happened. I even went to the mall for a couple of hours, which I usually hate, just to kill time. Life got a little easier when Monday arrived. The worst times were at night, when I lay in the dark, wondering what my life would look like from now on. Will I be left alone? Will I have to start dating again, hoping to somehow find a woman who could give me the joy I felt with Ellen? Or maybe the nights weren't the worst moments were waking up in the morning. I would wake up and sleepily look for Ellen next to me, then suddenly remember that I was not at home, not in my bed next to her, but in a hotel room, alone. I was here because I left my wife, and she left because she slept with someone else. Arthur and I continued to meet twice a week. Our sessions focused almost obsessively on the question of Bridget and whether I could resist her. I couldn't let go of this moment. If I believed that I would have refused Bridget's offer, that I would have remained faithful to Ellen in the face of such temptation, then I simply could not understand how to forgive Ellen for what she had done. But if I gave in to Bridget, then I am no better than Ellen. I am just as vulnerable to temptation and have no right to feel morally superior. My loyalty in her betrayal would come down to a matter of luck, to a simple coincidence of circumstances. Arthur tried to explain to me that this question had no answer and that, in the end, it didn't matter. He pointed out that I felt the same sudden, irrational desire for another person that Ellen did. No one will ever know if I could have resisted Bridget, but that's not the point. The point is that I was able to understand what Ellen felt that made her do what she did. Now, I need to allow my compassion to outweigh my indignation and hurt, because in fact, I knew what it was like to struggle with this unbearable feeling of lust. Can I forgive Ellen for her weakness? I didn't know, but after 3 weeks away from home, I was ready to find out. I called Ellen every 3 or 4 days, but the conversations were always very short, just to let her know I was okay. Now, I called on Saturday for a different purpose. "Ellen, it's Dan." "Hello, dear." She sounded happy to hear me. "I plan to return home today. I don't know what will happen to us next, but sitting alone in a hotel room is no longer helping me. I think we have a lot to discuss, and it's best to do it at home." Her answer sounded restrained but joyful. "This is great, Dan. I'll be glad to see you again. I missed you. I'll be there in an hour, okay?" When I returned home and carried my suitcase to the door, Ellen was already waiting for me. She was smiling, but her face seemed tense, and she looked tired. She probably hadn't slept well, just like me. I wondered if she had spent the night with Chris. It seemed unlikely, but I no longer trusted her enough to be confident in my guesses about her. I immediately carried my suitcase upstairs and placed it on the bed in the guest room. Ellen's face showed shock. I said bluntly, "I'm not going to sleep in her bedroom, Ellen. Not after what you and Chris did there." She blushed, and I saw tears in her eyes. She lowered her head but didn't say anything. I went downstairs to the kitchen for a cup of coffee. I poured another one for Ellen, and we sat down at the table. We hadn't touched each other since I entered the house. I said, "This is how things are. I'm much calmer than I was when I left. I had time to come to terms with what happened. I'm still very hurt, but not as angry anymore. It's more like I'm just sad. I guess I haven't stopped loving you. I can't just turn off this feeling like a water tap. But I don't trust you anymore, and I don't see how that trust can ever be returned." Ellen simply nodded, looking completely miserable. "But there's a story I have to tell you that you may not know anything about. This is the main reason I returned home. It concerns something that happened 6 years ago. Do you remember Bridget Zuzik?" I told Ellen the whole story, much the same way I had told it to Arthur George. She listened attentively, surprised from time to time, but didn't interrupt until I had finished. Then she said, after a short pause, "Wow, Dan, I can't believe how similar this story is to what happened to me and Chris. Except that you and she will never." I nodded. "Yes, and I've discussed this with my therapist many times. Could I have resisted Bridget? Perhaps I wouldn't have resisted, and then I have no right to punish you for what you did." "No, Dan," Ellen said with unexpected firmness. "Whatever your fantasies were, you never acted on them. It doesn't matter the circumstances, you have not cheated, broken your vows, or jeopardized our marriage." "I did. But you also confessed to me, Ellen. You didn't let it turn into a long-term affair, and you didn't keep me in the dark." After a pause, I asked the question I swore I wouldn't ask myself, "Have you seen him again?" She shook her head. "No, Dan. I told you this won't happen." Her face was serious and completely sincere, but I was torn by how little I believed her. What a fragile thing trust is. How the hell do you put it back together after it's destroyed? We had a quiet dinner, then watched TV together. I think we were both trying to make it seem like a normal evening. Neither of us wanted to deal with the pain again. But when we went upstairs to bed, it was hard to ignore the fact that we were going to different rooms. Ellen said, "Honey, I understand why you don't want to be in the bedroom. Can I join you in the guest room tonight?" I looked at her. I was expecting this question and was going to say no, but a different answer came out of my mouth. "I'm not ready to make love, Ellen. But if you were a regular nightie, nothing pretty, I'd love to hug you before bed." She nodded with a shy smile and went into the bedroom. A few minutes later, after she had changed and brushed her teeth, I was lying in bed when she came into my arms again, looking very weary. I hugged her, and she snuggled gently against me, resting her head on my shoulder. I wasn't ready to talk, my emotions were too close to the surface. Without a word, I turned off the light. We lay quietly, listening to each other's breathing, and thank God, I soon fell asleep. It would be wonderful to say that since I returned home, my relationship with Ellen has only improved, but that wouldn't be true. We lived in a state of some kind of unstable semi-intimacy. There were some things where we enjoyed spending time with each other. At times, we would fall back into our old habits of having long conversations about all sorts of topics. We worked well together around the house, cooking, cleaning, sharing other responsibilities, just like before. But we never returned to our nightlife, not even to hugging and kissing. The only physical contact between us was in bed at night, when we would just hold each other, and the shadow seemed to hang over us, her betrayal with Chris. Neither of us wanted to discuss it, but the feelings associated with it never went away. I continued to see Arthur George. I had a plan to test Ellen, and he couldn't talk me out of it. "Dan," he said, "you have to understand that you won't get anywhere with this plan. If she fails your test, you'll be convinced that you need a divorce. And if she passes it, it still won't rid you of all your fears. It just doesn't make sense." Part of me knew he was right, but I stubbornly refused to back down. I chose a morning when I knew Ellen would be at work to go home and check her email. Her computer at home was linked to the system she used at work, so I could see all her incoming and outgoing emails. First, I checked to see if she had any contact with Chris since they spent that day in bed. I didn't find anything. I then decided to write to Chris myself, sending him a carefully crafted letter on behalf of Ellen. Here's what I wrote. Dear Chris, I've thought about you a lot since we spent that day together. Could you come to my house this Thursday at 7 p.m.? Dan won't be home until 10 o'clock, so we'll have plenty of time for the two of us. This may sound stupid, but please don't reply to this letter, just come if you can. And when you come, pretend that I never sent you this letter. I'd really appreciate it if you could just pretend you came by accident. Hope to see you on Thursday. With love, Ellen. When Thursday came, I called Ellen around 2 p.m. and told her that we had a serious problem with the server and that I would have to work until 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. I told her to eat dinner without me and that I would find something for myself when I returned. Of course, there was no server repair. At 6:45 p.m., I was sitting in my car, parked 6 houses away, in a place where I could see when Chris would arrive and leave. My test for Ellen was simple. She would either send Chris away or go back to bed with him. I assumed that if they just talked, he wouldn't stay for more than 30 or 40 minutes. If an hour passed, it would be obvious that things had gone wrong. As Arthur said, he thought the idea was completely useless, but I just couldn't let it go. So I sat, listening to the radio in the car, thinking about what awaited me next in life. Chris arrived at 7:05 and headed straight for my house. I didn't see Ellen open the door, but a few moments later, Chris walked inside, and the door closed behind him. I sat and listened to music but practically didn't perceive it. The first half hour wasn't too bad, but then it got really hard. I silently begged the door of the house to open, but it did not move. I closed my eyes for 10 minutes, and when I opened them again, only 30 seconds had passed. At 8:15, I realized the worst. I had orchestrated my own heartbreak. My wife was cheating on me again with Chris, and I was the one who made it happen. I wanted an answer, and my God, I got it. At 8:30, I realized I was crying. By 8:45, I couldn't take it anymore. Why was I even sitting here? I could walk in, find them in bed, and play the final scene of the destruction of our marriage. I started the car, but before I put it in drive, I saw Chris come out of my house, get into his car, and drive away. I quickly drove to the house and burst inside, hoping to catch my guilty wife trying to clean up the evidence of her crime. When I entered the house, Ellen was sitting in the kitchen, fully dressed in the same clothes she wore to work. She looked at me in surprise and said, "Dan, are you done yet?" Then she noticed my face, wet with tears. I must have looked terrible, and she exclaimed, "Darling, what's wrong with you?" I ignored her and looked around. There were 2 empty coffee cups on the table. I ran upstairs to the bedroom. The bed was neatly made. I tore the covers off to check the sheets, but they were clean. I quickly checked all the other beds in the house, and the result was the same. I heard Ellen come upstairs and say, "Dan, what's going on?" I ignored her and ran to the bathroom, looking for signs that someone had taken a shower, but the shower was dry. I looked in the laundry basket, then in the closet and under the bed, searching for clothes that she might have taken off when they started making love, but I didn't find anything. Upset and confused, I fell on the bed. Ellen looked at me with concern in her eyes. "Dan, what the hell is going on?" I suddenly burst into tears. "I know Chris was here tonight, and I know you slept with him again." She looked at me straight in the eyes and said, "Yes, Chris was here, but no, I didn't sleep with him. And I never will again, Dan." I couldn't stop crying. It felt like weeks of pain and feelings had finally burst through, and I couldn't control them. "Then what the hell were you doing in this house for almost 2 hours?" Ellen sat next to me on the bed and hugged me quietly. Calmly, she said, "We were talking, Dan. Perhaps he came with the intention that we would make love again, but he didn't touch me, and I didn't touch him. We just sat in the kitchen, drank coffee, and talked. And now he's gone, and you need to tell me what the hell is going on. How did you know he was here?" "I organized it myself." I screamed. "I sent him a letter on your behalf, asking him to come today and said I wouldn't be there until late evening. I sat in the car down the street and watched him when he came and when he left. I thought that if you didn't sleep with him, he would leave in half an hour, but he stayed here for an hour and 45 minutes. I couldn't pull myself together. Damn it, Ellen! Do you see what I've become? I'm sneaking around, playing stupid spy games with my own wife, a pathetic, deceived husband trying to catch his wife in the act. She didn't say anything. She just held me tightly as I cried. When I calmed down, I sat up and looked at her. She was crying too, her face was in tears. Suddenly, I couldn't stand being around her anymore. I couldn't stand her touch or her pitiful, loving expression. I abruptly pulled away from her and went into the guest room. I undressed, brushed my teeth, put on my boxers, and went to bed. The door didn't lock, but I closed it, letting Ellen know that I didn't want her around that night. I longed for sleep, but it did not come. More than an hour later, I was still in the dark, restless, and miserable. Then I heard Ellen quietly enter the room. I turned over on the bed without saying a word, so that if she lay down, my back would be to her. Ignoring this silent rejection, she carefully climbed into bed and pressed herself against me. She slid her arm under mine and hugged my chest. She didn't say anything, thank God. I didn't want to hear a word she had to say. After a few minutes, just holding me, she began to caress me. Her lips brushed the back of my head and neck again and again, and her hand gently rested on my chest before lowering to my waist. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to reject her, but I didn't want to talk to her. Plus, it felt nice. We hadn't been intimate for over a month. It was the longest period of our lives without intimate. Part of me hoped that I could silently reject her simply by not reacting or being aroused by her touch. It worked for a while. She continued to press herself against me, her hand gently and lovingly touching me. Usually, in such situations, I would become excited within a minute, but I remained completely lethargic. Great, I thought. To hell with you, I don't need your pathetic affection. But after a while, the feeling of her hand on me, her kisses on my neck, and the warmth of her body against mine started to take their toll. I began to feel a pull. She purred contentedly in my ear while continuing to cuddle up to me. I was still completely confused. Her body, her lips, and her touch gave me comfort and longing, and I wanted more, but at the same time, I was angry and hurt, overcome by an irrational desire to reject her. If I felt like she was seducing me out of her own intimate desire, that might have been okay. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was just trying to win me back, as if this was a way to make amends, to make me believe that she wanted me, and I would forgive her. I felt manipulated, and it made me much angrier than excited. Without a word, I abruptly pulled away from her embrace, got out of bed, and left the room without turning around. I went downstairs to the living room, found a spare blanket in the closet, and settled down on the couch for the night. I listened, hoping to hear what was happening upstairs, but I heard nothing, no word from Ellen, no sobs. I lay there, unable to sleep, wondering if I had done the right thing. There was no answer. Ellen's story. Every time Dan called, I was hopeful that he might be ready to come home. But each time, the conversations were brief, businesslike, and then he would say goodbye. I didn't know what to do. I was patient and gave him time, but it didn't seem to help. After 3 weeks, he finally called and said he was coming home. I was delighted, but then immediately got scared. Maybe he was returning not to make peace, but to discuss divorce. Or perhaps he was hoping that I would say and do the right thing to convince him to stay, but I didn't know what that was supposed to be. When Dan entered the house, I was shocked. He looked terrible, as if he had aged 20 years. He had huge circles under his eyes, and his shoulders were slumped. He looked old and broken. I thought I understood what he was going through, how much pain he was in, but seeing him like this, I realized that it was much worse than I had imagined. In the first few days, I was full of hope that we could gradually return to our relationship. We didn't kiss, let alone make love, but at least Dan let me sleep in his arms in the guest bed. This gave me great comfort. But over time, it seemed that the situation was only getting worse, more tension, less communication. We could carry out daily duties together, but there was little to no casual joy in each other's company. I didn't know what to do. Dan seemed reluctant to discuss anything serious, and I figured that since he was seeing a therapist, my best course of action would be to be patient and loving, giving him time to process his feelings. Then, one evening when Dan called and said he would have to stay at work until 10 p.m., Chris rang the doorbell. I was terrified. To be honest, my first reaction was not desire, but fear. I think I mumbled something like, "What are you doing here?" And this clearly didn't sound hospitable, but he just smiled sweetly and said, "Hi, Ellen, can I come in for a few minutes?" I invited him into the kitchen, and we sat down. I poured us both a cup of coffee. We looked at each other, more to keep Chris at a distance than for any other reason. I told him how Emily had nearly driven me crazy when she told me that Chris had said he liked our dinner. I turned it into a funny story, describing my panic and Emily's innocence, and soon Chris and I were laughing. This relieved the tension, thank God. Then Chris said, "I missed you, Ellen." The time we spent together was incredible. I've never experienced anything like this in my life. Of course, it's entirely up to you, but I'd love to be with you again. He looked at me seriously but friendly, without flirting, and I appreciated it. I just sat there, trying to sort out my feelings. I knew my heart was racing, but my body didn't react the same way as last time. Although I was still attracted to Chris, the attraction was under control. Previously, his mere presence deprived me of the ability to think rationally. My body responded with immediate desire, but now, although I still felt temptation, it was balanced by a clear understanding of the consequences. It was like standing in front of incredibly delicious peaches in a store. I knew I could take one, bite into it, and the juice would run down my chin, and the taste would be fantastic. But I also knew it would be stealing. It would be wrong, and I could get caught. As I sat across from Chris, I realized with great relief that I could say no. Moreover, I could say no without dying of disappointment. The responsibilities of marriage, like any other responsibilities, sometimes mean you can't get what you want, from little things like a night out when your partner wants to stay home, to big things like having fantastic intimacy with Chris. I had already broken this commitment once, and it was gnawing at me. But sitting here now, looking at Chris, I almost triumphed in the knowledge that I would not do this again. Sorry, Chris, I won't lie and say that I don't feel a huge temptation, you wouldn't believe me anyway. That day was simply amazing. I always thought the phrase "turn the world upside down" was just an expression, until you really turn mine upside down. We both laughed, and I continued, but despite how wonderful it was, it put my marriage to Dan at risk, and I'm scared to death of losing him. Realizing this made me see how much more important he is to me, much more important than even mind-blowing intimate with you. So while our day together will always be one of my sweetest memories, it was our only time. And one more thing, this is probably even for the better. I don't think the second time would ever compare to the first. He laughed again and said, "I'm not sure about that, but I understand you, Ellen. I felt pretty bad about being with a married woman, but I just followed your lead. And, to be honest, I was incredibly attracted to you. But in a way, it's also a relief for me not to delve further into something that could destroy your marriage. And if, suddenly, you and Dan don't end up together, I will always regret that I played any role in this." I shook my head and squeezed Chris' hand tightly. "Chris, what we did was not your fault. I know you find me attractive, and I'm so glad about that, but we both know that I was the initiator. I did everything except take off my clothes right in the restaurant. You are not to blame for anything, and I say this seriously. When the main problem between us was resolved, we relaxed and chatted for some more time. I learned about his studies, and we shared stories about our struggles with the university administration. I was still surprised at how calm I felt, how my attraction to Chris, although still present, was now under control. He was still an attractive man. If I weren't married, I would happily go to bed with him again. But I was married, and accepting that turned out to be easier than I expected. After a while, Chris said that it was time for him to study, and we said goodbye in a friendly way without even hugging. It seemed like the safest option. I had just returned to my chair when Dan burst into the house, looking like a madman. His face was red and tear-streaked, and he was breathing heavily. When I realized a few minutes later that he had planned to catch me and Chris in bed, and that he had set it all up, I was angry at first. But then, I just became deeply sad. Dan resorting to such a step showed how much pain he was in and how hard he was trying to cope with his feelings. My wonderful, strong, loving husband acted like a crazy person, and it was all my fault. After he broke away from my embrace and went to bed, I thought for a long time, how can I reach him? Was there any way to convey to him my love and repentance? How can I fix things? Until this time, when we went to bed, I just snuggled up to him but did not take the initiative. I waited for him to make the first move. But that night, I decided to act differently. I took off all my clothes and carefully slid into bed with him. I stroked his chest, then lowered my hand down. I was surprised that his arousal didn't appear immediately, but I continued my caresses, and soon everything was as I had hoped. I began to press closer to him, and anticipating our first time in more than a month, our longest period without intim. And then, suddenly, he violently pushed me away without a word. He got out of bed and went downstairs. I was shocked and offended. I almost burst into tears, but I held it in, lying quietly in the dark, listening to his steps. I hoped he would return, but it soon became clear that he was planning to spend the night apart. I felt hurt, frustrated, and didn't know what to do. I greeted his return with love and patience. I gently gave him time to come back to me physically and waited patiently for him to make a move. That night, I decided to take action, using my body to show him my love. But both approaches didn't work. I was completely confused and didn't know what to do next. In the morning, when I quietly went downstairs, Dan was fast asleep under a blanket on the sofa. I thought he needed rest and didn't wake him up. I got dressed, had breakfast, left him a short note, and left for work. The note said, "Dear Dan, I love you so much and I'm so sorry. I don't know what to do. When you return home, I hope that we could gradually find our way back to each other, but this doesn't seem to work. I'm trying my best to show you how much I love you and make amends for what I did, but it seems that we are not getting closer. On the contrary, we are moving away. Would you consider letting me go with you to meet Arthur and George? Do you think this could be useful? I don't want to interfere, it's all up to you. I'm just looking for any way I can help solve our problems that are entirely my fault. Please let me know what you think. Your loving wife, Ellen." The weekend passed quietly. When I returned from work on Friday, Dan was still visibly unhappy, but calm. We didn't talk much, but he told me that he had contacted Arthur George, and they agreed that I should come to the next session on Tuesday. Over the weekend, we were polite but not warm. I didn't know how to approach Dan, and he seemed okay with us going about our daily chores and household duties almost in silence. I was desperately looking forward to Tuesday, hoping that our appointment with the therapist could set us on the right track. Arthur George, thank God, made me feel comfortable right away. I had feared that he would be judgmental or, worse, hostile. After all, he had been working with my husband for several weeks, helping him deal with the terrible pain I was causing. But Arthur was straightforward and kind, and my anxiety quickly dissipated. Instead of making me relive my experience with Chris, my greatest fear, Arthur asked Dan and me to talk about what happened last Thursday. It was obvious that Arthur knew about Dan's plan to test me with Chris. He listened carefully and seriously to each of us, observing our reactions to each other's versions. This was the first time Dan had heard about my conversation with Chris, and he kept his eyes on me the entire time. I tried to emphasize that my feelings for Chris had changed, that I no longer felt the uncontrollable passion that had driven me to bed with him that day. I so hoped that Dan would hear this, believe me, and begin to feel less angry and humiliated. When we finished telling our versions of the events of that night, Arthur said, "I would like to focus on what happened that evening while you were in bed." "Fine. I'll ask each of you to try something. Please take a couple of minutes and try to switch roles. Ellen, imagine that you were the one who was betrayed. Imagine that Dan cheated on you with Bridget. You're angry and hurt, and then he comes to you in bed that evening. Dan, I want you to imagine the same thing, that you cheated on Ellen with Bridget, that she is very hurt and angry, and so you approach her that night in bed. Each of you, just imagine this for a minute, and then I'll ask you to share your thoughts." I was amazed by the feelings that suddenly flared up in me. When we were both ready to talk, Arthur nodded to Dan to begin. Dan spoke first. "I would feel like I really want to reassure Ellen that I still love her and want her. What I did hurt her so much, it hurt her pride and destroyed her confidence. I would only sleep with her to show her that I really wanted her and loved her. It would be a small first step toward restoring her faith in that. Okay, Ellen, Arthur said. Can you tell us how you would feel if the situation were reversed and Dan approached you? I looked straight at Arthur. The rage I was feeling suddenly flared up, and I continued, that son of a b********** H had a hot night with Bridget, and he knows how depressed I am. So, he climbs into bed, touches me, and expects me to get horny and let him have a night with me to make myself feel better. I know who he's thinking about and who he wants. How can I see this as anything other than hypocritical? Oh, honey, forgive me. Is this supposed to convince me that it's me he wants? Complete nonsense. When I finished, I was almost screaming. I could hardly believe how angry I was, thinking about that night from Dan's point of view. Then, in silence, I cried. Oh, Dan, I said, is that really what it looked like to you? He answered quietly. Then there was silence again as I continued to cry. Finally, after a long pause, Arthur cleared his throat to get our attention and spoke. I think we all see the problem you're facing now. Dan, putting himself in Ellen's shoes, was able to understand that her action was a loving desire to restore your intimacy. But Ellen, imagining the situation from Dan's side, became angry, considering it a hypocritical offer for some superficial makeup into him. But I want you to see the positive aspects too. In all these sessions with Dan, and today with both of you here, I see two people who love and appreciate each other very, very much. I see a strong marriage with a big problem, but not a fundamentally broken relationship. Secondly, notice how both of you were able to show empathy. Each of you was able to understand what the other was feeling. Even though Dan was very angry about what you did that night, Ellen, he was able to understand that it was a loving gesture. And Ellen, you were able to understand why your actions angered Dan so much. Yes, Arthur, but I'm not sure where this leads us, I said. I want to show Dan my love for him. And yes, I desire him. I want to be with him again, intimacy, a lot, and only with him. But there seems to be no way in which I could express these feelings in a way that he would believe. To my surprise, Dan agreed with me. She's right. I'm afraid I just don't feel like I can trust anything she says or does now. She wants to save our marriage, and I see all her actions through this prism, her own interests and probably her fault. Arthur reacted quickly, but Dan, the fact that Ellen wants to save your marriage, doesn't that in itself mean something? You don't think it's just because she likes your house or doesn't want to cook for herself, do you? Dan nodded slowly. I guess I see it. She loves me. She wants me in her life. Yes, I believe that. But it's much harder to believe that she wants me, that it's me she wants in bed, not Chris. I quietly said, I rejected him, Dan. You tested me, and I rejected it. This must mean something. Yes, Ellen, this means that our marriage is more important to you than sleeping with Chris again. That's something. But that doesn't mean you want to sleep with me and not Chris. It just means you realize you can't save our marriage if you sleep with him. So maybe this means you're willing to settle for sleeping with old Dan, better than nothing, perhaps. But this is far, far from a convincing confirmation of my attractiveness or my abilities in bed. Dan, you told me yourself that you had an intimate with me for months and imagined that I was Bridget Zuzik. So if I think about Chris from time to time, what's the difference? Dan looked at me with such sadness that I could hardly stand the look. Honey, the difference is that you never knew that Bridget was in my head. You never felt like you had to compete with her. You were calmly confident in my love and desire, and my fantasy about Bridget always remained just a fantasy. And you slept with Chris, and I know you slept with him, and I know it was incredible. So now I have to compete with it, and I will have to do it forever. I don't know how I can ever be sure that it's me you want and not just a warm body that you can rub against, imagining that it's Chris inside you again. There was a long silence. I sat there, completely devastated by Dan's words, trying not to cry again. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Arthur said, obviously, we still have a lot of work to do, but I encourage both of you not to give in to your most pessimistic fears. You have a lot of love and understanding to build on. Dan, I think Ellen is absolutely right about one thing. At the moment, she simply does not know how to convey her love to you, her remorse, or her desire for you. So you'll have to find out for yourself. You need to figure out how she can do this without making you even more angry. And you, Ellen, will have to be patient, because right now, I don't think Dan has the slightest idea how to let you in. And finally, he continued, I propose that we continue to meet with Dan twice a week, and Ellen will come with him once every 2 weeks. Most of the work will be easier to get done if it's just the two of us, but I also want us to check in regularly to see how you both are doing on both sides of your marriage. As we left the office and headed to the parking lot, I said, Arthur is a very nice person. Dan replied, yes, we were lucky to have him. Then, without saying a word, he took my hand and held it gently until we reached my car. Dan's story, I knew that Arthur was right. It was up to me to find a way to regain intimacy with Ellen. I made it clear to both of us that she couldn't take the lead, that I simply didn't trust any of her moves. I couldn't shake the feeling that she came to my bed out of guilt or apology, not out of desire. We somehow dragged this out for another month or so, waiting at home for Christmas with the kids. It was a little stressful because we didn't want them to know what we were going through. At Ellen's suggestion, we started sleeping in the master bedroom again, a couple of nights before Danny and Alexis came to stay. Luckily, they were so happy to see us that Ellen and I were able to relax and just be loving parents for a week. After a couple of days, the children were almost never home, spending all their time with old friends they hadn't seen for most of the year. In early January, Ellen asked me to talk after dinner. Honey, I'm going to take a few days and go to Diana's. It's not a very busy time at work, and they won't mind if I'm gone. I nodded, just looking at her. I understood that this meant more than just a visit. Finally, she continued, I just don't know how to get through to you, Dan. We live in this house. We are polite and kind to each other. We go to Arthur's together, but we are stuck. You know I love you, and you should know that I want you, too. I want to make love to you again, but neither of us knows how. Arthur continues to say that it must come from you, but it doesn't come. Suddenly, I felt cold and slightly angry. Does this mean you want to break up, Ellen? Are you saying you're leaving? My voice sounded harsher than I intended, and I saw her eyes widen in surprise. No, Dan, she said, reaching across the table and gently taking my hand. Nothing like that. I'm in this with you until the end, until the day you kick my cheating fifth place out of your life. She tried to smile, albeit sadly. I just thought that a short break for a few days might be good for both of us. It would clear things up a little, and I haven't seen Diana and her children for so long. But I want to spoil them a little. I relaxed. I understood what Ellen meant. Okay, honey. When are you going to leave? I'll take a couple of hours off to take you to the airport. My week without Ellen was calm and contemplative. I missed her and noticed that I often talked to her in my head. Her absence allowed me to more fully appreciate all the good things in our relationship and suffer less from our intimate impasse. I found myself mentally asking her all sorts of strange and random questions that I wanted to discuss with her when she returned. A few days later, Ellen called and confirmed that her return flight would be on Thursday afternoon around 3 o'clock. I had an appointment that I couldn't cancel, so she was going to take a taxi home. But when I turned into the driveway around 5:30 p.m., there were no lights on in the house. Instead, I saw Ellen lying at the foot of the stairs on the street, in her warm coat, with her suitcases nearby. I ran to her. She was unconscious, her skin cold and damp. I quickly opened the door, then came back, picked her up, and carefully carried her inside, straight to our bedroom. She made a sound slightly and began to come to her senses as I laid her on the bed and covered her with several blankets. Then, I ran to the kitchen to boil the kettle. A few minutes later, her suitcases were already inside, and I was sitting next to her with 2 cups of hot tea. Ellen woke up and tried to smile at me, but she was very cold. Dan. I probably fell. I don't remember well, she said. It's okay, I said, lying down next to her and hugging her to warm her up. I tried to calm her down as she gradually warmed up. When the shaking subsided a little, I sat up and gave her tea, making sure she drank it in small sips. There was a small drop of blood on the right side of her forehead. When I carefully felt it, I discovered a large, painful lump. While Ellen was drinking her tea, I brought a small ice pack and gently placed it on her head, holding her close to me again. She returned to herself a little more, and I began to relax. I realized that my heart was pounding from tension. Thank you, Dan. Tea and blankets, that's what I need. I still don't remember completely, but I think I slipped on the steps and hit my head. Lord, how long did I lie there? The taxi left me a little before 5. What time did you come home? I realized she must have been there for about half an hour in January in Columbus, Ohio. Thank God I didn't stay late at work. Honey, how about a hot bath? You're not shaking as much anymore, but I'm sure you're still cold. She nodded, smiling. Thank you for being so caring, Dan. I really missed you. You know, I had a wonderful visit with Diana and her family, but I really wanted to come back here to you. When the bath was ready, I carefully lifted Ellen from the blankets. I even enjoyed watching her undress while I took off her clothes, but when I took off her socks, I was overcome with horror. Her right ankle was purple and very swollen. It was obviously badly stretched, if not broken. Not wanting Ellen to stand on it, I carefully carried her straight into the tub and gently lowered her into the water, lifting her sore leg onto the edge of the tub. She sighed happily, settling into the hot water. God, how good it is, Dan. Thank you. How bad does your ankle hurt? Can you move your foot? She slowly rotated her foot, wincing. It hurts a lot, but it doesn't seem to be broken. Everything seems to work. I can move my toes. I came back with another ice pack. When I returned, I secured it to her ankle with a bandage and then placed another ice pack on her head. That's it, I said. Does it still hurt anywhere, or are there any bruises? She laughed. No, it seems that's all, except my ego took a bit of a beating. I'm not so old that I can't climb my own steps. While Ellen was relaxing in the bathtub, I called our doctor and described her injuries. After making sure she was awake and fully conscious, he said there was little chance of a concussion. He agreed that the ankle was probably just sprained and said I could bring it in for a checkup the next morning. He reminded me of what I already knew: ice, keep the leg elevated, ibuprofen every 5 to 6 hours, no weight bearing on the leg for at least 3 days, and no alcohol. I quickly made the chicken salad, made the soup, and brought the food upstairs to our bedroom. By that time, Ellen was already ready to get out of the bath. The cold had long gone. I made her sit on the toilet while I dried her legs and feet, and then she leaned on my shoulder, standing on her good leg while I dried her body. You literally seduce me with your gentle touches, Dan, she said with a smile. I smiled back and continued my pleasant activity. Somehow, caring for her, knowing that she needed me, I felt that desire for her had awakened again. It was the longest I'd seen her without anything in months, since she slept with Chris, and her body was magnificent, round, feminine. She sighed as I dried her breasts, and I had to stop myself. I carried Ellen back to bed, helped her into her nightgown, laid her down on the pillows, and again applied ice packs to her ankle and forehead. Then, I placed a tray of food in front of her. We sat and ate together. She told me about Diana and her husband, about what was happening with their children. I shared recent minor disasters at work, and we talked about the new economics department chair, who fortunately understood that my budget requests were for technology, not for my office setup. When we finished eating, Ellen looked a little sleepy, so I put away the dishes and turned off the light. Sorry, honey, she said. I want to stay and be with you, but I'm just passing out. It's okay, honey, I replied. You had a nasty fall, lay on the street, and I'm sure your body needs rest. See you in the morning. I headed toward the door. Dan, she called with concern in her voice, you're not going to sleep in another room tonight, are you? I had actually planned to sleep in the guest room so I wouldn't accidentally roll onto her bad ankle in my sleep, but I heard concern in her voice, so I answered, no, honey. I'll be back a little later, and we'll be here all night. I walked up, kissed her tenderly, covered her with a blanket, and left the room. As I cleaned the kitchen and loaded the dishwasher, I thought about what was happening to me. At first, of course, I was very worried about Ellen, but once I was sure she was fine and had nothing more serious than a sprained ankle, I suddenly realized that caring for her turned me on, not just her without clothes, not just the fact that I was drying her after her bath. there was something else, something connected with her vulnerability. I knew she needed me, and taking care of her gave me not only pleasure but also intimate arousal. When I got into bed, I had to stop myself from reaching out to her. The next morning, Drive Westcott performed a full examination on Ellen and then said that not only did she have a sprained ankle, but she also had a mild concussion. Lots of bed rest, ice, and keep your leg elevated. Ibuprofen every 5 to 6 hours. No driving. Keep your leg off for at least 3 days. No alcohol, he said briefly. Call me if there are any problems. Clear? He gave us crutches, which I put away in the car, but I carried Ellen from the office to the car and then from the car to the house, and again to our bed. 2 hours outside the house had completely exhausted her, and she slept almost all day, waking up only for dinner. I became a nurse for the weekend, or at least a home assistant. I cooked all of Ellen's meals, helped her get to the bathroom or shower, and kept a constant supply of ice and ibuprofen. Mostly, I liked it. I enjoyed being helpful and caring for her, and I enjoyed our time together. As her concussion subsided and she became more like herself, we had many hours to just talk and laugh like we used to do so many years ago. There was only one thing I didn't like. I often touched Ellen, saw her without anything, and it turned me on. This was something new. I hadn't felt any intimate desire since I found out about Ellen and Chris. I didn't even satisfy myself, I just didn't have night feelings. But now they were back, and for some reason, it made me angry. By Monday, Ellen was able to return to work, although I had to drive her around and help her in and out of the car. She moved quite well with crutches. In my session with Arthur on Tuesday, I told him about her fall and how I had been caring for her all weekend. I then told him about my night arousal and how angry it made me when I looked at Arthur. There was a half smile on his face, which for Arthur was the same as if someone else laughed out loud. What? I asked, a little irritated. Is it so funny that I was turned on by seeing my wife without clothes and holding her in my arms? No, Dan, it's not funny, he answered calmly. Actually, this is great news, but I can't help but laugh a little that your reaction to these feelings is one of anger rather than pleasure. I thought for a minute, and then I laughed too. I think I understand what you mean, I said. He asked, why? I think it makes me feel vulnerable, I said, and that puzzled me. Until now, I had no desire to make love to Ellen, and this gave me a sense of control, as if it was important to be able to resist her. As if wanting night meant I was giving up on something. He nodded. Surrender to what? I suppose I'll give up my wounded pride, I said. Every day when I'm not having intim with Ellen, it's like I'm telling her, see how wounded I am? Do you see what you did to me? Now that I say it out loud, it seems pretty stupid. Cutting off your nose to spite your face. Arthur listened silently, giving me time to think about everything. And one more thing, I finally continued. I still don't trust her intimacy. I'm afraid that she will pretend to be excited and passionate about me just to please me, to stroke my ego, and just the thought of it just pisses me off. It makes me want to become a monk and never touch her again. After a long pause, Arthur said, well, Dan, there can be many reasons for a night. It's perfectly fine to have a night just for your own pleasure, to satisfy your own desires, as long as you don't force Ellen to do something she doesn't want to do. There's no need to think of intim as a test, where Ellen will rate you on how much you turn her on or how much she wants you. We talked about it some more, and Arthur's words stayed in my head as I left his office and followed Ellen to work. She immediately noticed that I was puzzled by something, and we didn't talk on the way home. When I carried her into the house, she probably expected us to go to the kitchen to prepare dinner, but instead, I went straight to the bedroom, where I carefully set her down on the floor, hugged her, and kissed her. It was our longest kiss in 3 months. Ellen, I want to make love right now. Do you agree? I asked. She smiled widely. Oh, honey, I interrupted. I don't want to talk. I just want to do it. I won't hurt you, but it will be hard for me. Fine, she said, her smile fading, replaced by uncertainty, but she nodded. I quickly turned on the heater in the bedroom to create a cozy atmosphere, took off my clothes, then slowly began to undress Ellen. I touched and stroked her body, removing each piece of clothing as she stood there, allowing me to enjoy her body. When she laid down completely without anything on the bed, I was very excited. There was still some anger in me. I was still angry that I wanted her, but I decided to ignore it. I pulled her toward me and kissed her deeply, running my tongue into her mouth. She responded, and we lay pressed against each other, my hands sliding over her body. I couldn't get enough of her body. It was like I'd never seen or touched her before. I stroked her arms and shoulders, her hips, her buttocks, and then gently laid her on her back and concentrated on her breasts. Ellen lay quietly, understanding that I wanted her to be passive, but her breathing indicated that she too was beginning to get excited. When I finished caressing her, I had a rough night with her. My mind was torn between excitement and anger. The image of Chris kept popping up in my head. How he was here in this bed, how he was inside Ellen just recently. But this did not weaken my arousal. On the contrary, it angered me and made me strive even more for my own pleasure. Something like, to hell with you, Chris, and to hell with you, Ellen, now it's my turn. When all the energy and tension left me, I didn't want to crush her with my weight, so I hugged her tightly to me and turned onto my side. I held her head on my shoulder, feeling her warm body pressed against me, listening to our breathing gradually slow down. I still didn't want her to talk, but after a few minutes, she raised her head and smiled at me, her eyes shining. Baby, it was so. No, I interrupted sharply, suddenly feeling angry. I don't care how it was for you. It wasn't about you. It was about me. You are my wife, and I have the right to have an intimate with you as I please. I know I can't do what Chris did, and I don't care. I'm the one you married, and I'm the only one you'll sleep with now. I tried to pull away from her and get out of bed, but she hugged me tight. Suddenly, I started crying, clinging to her, burying my face in her shoulder like a child. Ellen just held me quietly, saying, "Shoo, it's okay, baby," until I calmed down. Finally, when my tears dried up, I fell back on the bed, completely exhausted. I was too embarrassed to look at Ellen, but she just lay next to me, cuddled up to me, her head on my chest. After a long time, I sat up and looked at her. To my surprise, her face was also wet with tears. "Sorry," I said. "I don't know what." "Shoo," she interrupted, putting her fingers to my lips. "You don't need to say anything else. You're right. I am your wife, and only you can touch me and have a night with me." She smiled. There's nothing more to say. Half an hour later, we were in the kitchen in our dressing gowns, preparing dinner together. We hardly spoke, but I noticed that both of us were smiling and constantly touching each other with fleeting touches, either stroking the cheek or running a hand along the arm. We ate soup and roast beef sandwiches, and Ellen held my hand most of the time. We drank tea and ate a piece of pie, chatting about work and the children. When we finished, Ellen took my hand, looked at me seriously but with a smile, and pulled me toward the stairs. "Please," she asked. This time, it lasted longer and was even better than before. After dinner, Ellen knew I didn't want us to talk, but we both caressed and pleasured each other. I put her in one of my favorite positions. She was kneeling over me while I lay on my back. Our eyes locked on each other as if the whole world had momentarily disappeared. My lips touched her soft, velvety skin, and her every breath seemed to be an echo of my own. I gently touched her body, slowly stroking her back and shoulders, feeling her relax under my hands. Every moment was saturated with warmth and mutual understanding that had accumulated between us for many years. Our unity was felt on a new level, as if not just our bodies, but also our souls, were merging into one rhythm. She leaned slightly toward me, her hair sliding over my shoulders, and our eyes met. At that moment, I felt the depth that can only be felt with the person you truly love. In her eyes, one could read not just desire but understanding and complete dedication. We kissed, feeling each other's warmth, and it seemed that this kiss was the embodiment of every emotion we had ever felt. Every gesture, every touch, at that moment was important and meaningful. Then, she carefully pulled away, and I, not wanting to lose this connection, pulled her even closer to me, deepening our unity. I felt like we were getting closer with every moment, not only physically, but also on an emotional level. Our every movement was filled with tenderness and care for each other. We continued changing positions, and I laid her next to me, behind her back. She settled comfortably under my side, her body gently pressed against mine, and I enjoyed every movement, every breath she took. I felt her warmth gradually filling me, as if she were transferring part of her energy to me. We remained in this silence, where words were superfluous, touch spoke more than any conversation. I caressed her with caution, as if I were afraid to disturb the fragile magic of the moment. My fingers gently slid over her arm, her thigh, as if exploring every familiar detail anew, but with a renewed feeling. Our feelings intensified, and her movements became more and more confident. She moved closer to me, and I felt how her breathing became deeper and calmer. Her skin was warm, and I felt her gradually relax, surrendering to the moment with complete trust and calm. It was more than just physical pleasure, it was a moment of unity, when two people completely open up to each other, baring their souls and hearts. There was no rush. At that moment, we were together in this silence, in complete harmony with each other, as if all our worries and anxieties remained somewhere far away. She turned to me, her eyes shining, and there was a slight smile on her face that said more than words. This smile invited us to continue our dance. I was in no hurry. I wanted to prolong this union as long as possible, enjoying every moment, every touch, every movement of hers. It seemed to me that time had stopped, and the whole world stood still around us. I moved slowly, touching her skin, holding her tenderly, feeling our bodies find their rhythm. We were in sync, as if this moment had been destined for us. Everything was perfect: silence, our quiet signs, light touches, and that feeling of peace that comes only in moments of complete trust. We sank deeper and deeper into this feeling of closeness and mutual understanding. Every moment felt endless, every breath was a promise of even greater tenderness. At that moment, I realized that there is nothing more important than this connection, this feeling that we are one. Ellen pulled away from me. At first, I didn't understand why, but then she turned to me, her face rosy and beaming with happiness. I was afraid that she would talk, but she just came closer and started kissing me passionately. She kissed my lips deeply, then kissed my cheeks, my eyes, my forehead. She pressed my head to her lips and whispered, thank you," into my ears, gently running her fingers through my hair and stroking the back of my head. Then she returned to my lips, and we kissed for a long time. Finally, without another word, we turned off the light and fell asleep. Ellen's story. Thank God I hit my head, because after that first night of incredible intimacy, everything changed. I would like to say that everything went smoothly after that, but that would not be true. There were good days and bad ones, good times and not so good ones. On good days, we were so happy. I'd make Dan a particularly delicious breakfast, and then he'd take me upstairs to make love, and we'd both be late for work. Or he would show up at my office at noon with a picnic basket, and we would sit in the lobby of the university library while we ate. We started talking more again, like the good old days. Dan might ask, "Can you explain to me what the Paris Hilton phenomenon is? Why is this even interesting to anyone?" And we would laugh and discuss it for a while. Or I'd ask him why the same people who complain about high gas prices continue to buy SUVs that get 8 miles per gallon. In other words, we returned to our conversations on any topic, talking for hours. One night, he decided to make fun of me a little. We went to bed early and started making love. Dan started kissing me down there and had no intention of stopping. He teased me skillfully, playing with my feelings, bringing me to pleasure and then pausing to prolong the moment. His gentle touches and kisses were like a dance, moving from one movement to the next with perfect synchronicity. Each time the tension increased, he retreated, allowing me to cool down a little, and then returned again, increasing my desire. This went on for a long time until I couldn't hold it in anymore. The sensations overwhelmed me, and I was completely lost in the moment, experiencing an incredible feeling of liberation and pleasure. About 3 weeks after we started making love again, I plucked up the courage to ask Dan a question over dinner. "Honey, will it be okay if I start first?" "You mean in bed?" he asked. I nodded. "Do you remember that Arthur said that I would have to wait, that it would be up to you when I could show you how much I want you? Now that everything is so good with us, I feel it even more strongly." "Go on," he said. "Dan, there have been so many moments over the past couple of weeks when I've been dying to make love to you. For example, yesterday morning in the shower. I was lying in bed and madly wanted to come to you, but I was afraid. He thought for a minute and then said, "It seems like things are really different now. I no longer feel that you can pretend or that this is due to guilt or pity. At least, not that much. Try it next time you feel the urge, Ellen, and if it bothers me, I promise to say it gently. No more pushing away or suddenly jumping out of bed." Dan was silent for a moment and then added, "Can I tell you something else? That night when I actually jumped out of bed, I was still too angry and hurt then. But I want you to know that what you did was very cute. I'd like you to try again someday." I smiled, remembering that moment. I went to bed without a nightgown and pressed myself against him from behind, caressing him, rubbing my breasts against his back. This also turned me on very much, until the moment he rejected me. "I'll be happy to do it again," I said. "Are you busy in about 20 minutes? As soon as I finish with the dishes, you wash, I'll wipe," Dan answered with a smile. But as I said, there were also bad days. I came home one Thursday to find him sitting in a chair in the living room with a bottle of beer, his face cold and distant. Somehow, I immediately realized that there was no need to say anything. I knew what was going on. I sat on the floor next to his chair and hugged his legs, resting my head on his thigh. We sat in silence for a while. Finally, he spoke. "I think I'm getting better. I guess something stupid happened today. Harold told a dirty joke about a grown woman and a young guy, and it made me think about you and Chris again." I didn't answer. I just hugged his legs tighter and stayed there. A few minutes later, he said, "Okay, enough about that. How about dinner?" The moment passed, but there was a worse case. We had a night vigorously, both very excited, and suddenly he stopped abruptly. My eyes immediately opened in surprise, and I saw an expression of pain on his face. "What happened, dear?" I asked. Before I could stop myself, he simply winced, shook his head, and rolled over onto his back, pulling away. Several minutes passed before he spoke. "You sounded like you were really enjoying it, like you were really excited, Alan." This really turned me on, and then I suddenly thought, did you really sound like that to Chris? Maybe he turned you on as much as I did. Could Indy with me ever be as good as with him? He fell silent, and I didn't know whether to say anything. Anything seemed to me like it could easily be a mistake that would ruin everything. "Night with you is amazing, Dan. Sometimes it is gentle and loving, sometimes it is fast and passionate, like today, but it's always great. And you know what? I hardly think about intimate with Chris. Of course, I remember what we did, but it doesn't even occur to me to compare it with what we do." Dan looked at me, wanting to believe my words, but still doubtful. "Think about the last time we had dinner at Chez Marcel. The food was amazing, right? And when you ate your veal, did you compare it to food from another restaurant, or did you just enjoy how tasty it was?" Dan laughed and said, "I understand what you mean. In fact, I thought I should let Ellen try this." I hugged him tighter, and we just lay there together in silence. It was clear that there would be no more intimate that night, but the conversation was much more important. On a Saturday in late April, Dan suggested we go on a picnic and hike to one of our favorite lake spots, 20 miles from Columbus. It seemed to me that he was up to something, but I didn't ask questions. I just prepared us a delicious lunch, and we went. We walked for a couple of hours and then settled down on a blanket and had lunch. I was a little nervous, but Dan seemed relaxed and happy, so I wasn't afraid that anything bad would happen. We carried on our casual conversations as usual. After lunch, he sat down, leaning against a tree, and invited me to snuggle up to him. That's what I did. On Thursday, Arthur and I came to the conclusion that it was time for me to stop our sessions, Dan said. "Is it true?" "That's good news," I replied. "In general, we have been going to this for a long time, but something that I talked to him about this week finally convinced us both." Dan gently turned me so that he could see my face. "On Tuesday, I told Arthur that it seems that I still haven't completely forgiven you. I know that's not entirely right. I told him I forgave you, but part of me still holds on to what you did to Chris, holds on and uses it against you. I told him I wanted to let it go because it was stopping me from being happy. I said that this all seemed crazy to me because I was holding on to my painful feelings just so that I would have something to be angry with you about, or something to suffer about. You see, if I'm completely happy again, if you and I return to our loving relationship, that will mean that I've fully gotten over what happened, and then I won't be able to be angry at you for it anymore. So, in a weird way, I didn't allow myself to be completely happy because then I would have to admit that I'm not mad at you anymore. I would no longer have the moral advantage. I couldn't feel that you owe me anything more for making me suffer if I am no longer suffering. He looked at me carefully. Does this make sense to you? I think so. I think we all sometimes secretly hold on to feelings of resentment or anger because it makes us feel like someone owes us something, and sometimes we hold on to our grievances longer than necessary. Exactly, Dan nodded and smiled. In general, when I told Arthur all this, he thought about it and then said that we are ready to complete our sessions. We were silent for a minute, and I pressed myself closer to him. But I want to say something else, I continued. Even if you stopped feeling pain from what I did, I still haven't stopped feeling guilty, so I hope you don't mind if I continue to try to make amends for you. He smiled again. What are you planning? Well, I have a few ideas. For example, right now, I would like us to put away our lunch, finish our walk, then take a hot shower together, and then, with your permission, I want to have an intim with you until you lose consciousness. Permission has been given, Dan replied. When I got home, Dan had already started preparing dinner. I checked my answering machine and found one message that he hadn't erased. It was from Emily, inviting us to her annual terrace party in a couple of weeks. Feeling anxious, I headed to the kitchen and hugged him. Hello, dear. Did you hear the message? Yes, Emily and her party on the terrace. He looked at me carefully. You look upset. Are you worried about us meeting Chris? I nodded, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. You don't deserve to go through this, Dan. You don't have to pretend like nothing happened or communicate with him, pretending that I never did what I did. Dan smiled and kissed me. I've actually thought about this a lot, Ellen. Emily throws her own party every year, so I knew we'd have to deal with it. It's been a year now, and I'm happy with where we are. I can handle it. I can be a man. I can shake Chris's hand and have a polite conversation for a couple of minutes, only if you are completely mine again. You're completely mine again, aren't you, honey? I took a step back and looked seriously into his eyes. Then I said slowly, Yes, Dan, I'm yours, fully. I belong to you, always. I came closer, kissed him, and hugged him tightly. These lips are yours, I said, pointing to my lips. And this is yours. I took his hands and put them on my chest. And this is yours. I took his hand and slowly, gently lowered it into my pants. And this, I brought his other hand to my heart. Okay then, Dan said. In that case, we'll go to Emily's party, talk to everyone, including Chris, and have a good time. Then we'll return home and have the same intimate we had after last year's party, just you and me, darling, without Bridget, without Chris. Just the two of us. I kissed him again and hugged him tightly. It's a date, I said. What do you think of the second and concluding part of our story on behalf of the wife? It seems to me that the second part was more detective-like and more unfolded on behalf of the wife than on behalf of the husband, but also the husband acted differently according to the wife, not as in the first part. Who do you believe and what is your impression? Write in the comments. Until new videos.